Okay, thank you to everybody for coming. Sorry that we started late. I hope everybody had a great Chanukah. We are continuing our shiur on the Tefillah, and we are in middle of our discussion on Pesukei de Zimra. Now, Pesukei de Zimra, as we have so far seen, is a very interesting topic because the earliest history of Pesukei de Zimra is shrouded in mystery. And what we've been able to glean so far in our study of Pesukei de Zimra has been that the Pesukei de Zimra's origins are in the time of the earliest Tanaim. And just to recap, in the time of the Tanaim, there was a minhag to finish the Hallel every day, so to speak. That was what they called it, Gemirat Hallel. We don't know exactly what Pesukim they said, but by the time of the Gemara, at least the Talmud Bavli, they had called this collection of Pesukim the Pesukei de Zimra, the verses of song, not the chapters of song, but rather the verses of song, because it seems that there was a collection of verses, not just chapters of psalms, but a collection of songs and verses of song that were said every morning before the prayers. We find that the later Talmud, the Babylonian Talmudic sources tell us that these psalms were from Kuf Mem Hey, from what we know as Tehillah LeDavid, until the end of Tehillim, from Kuf Mem Hey, from Psalm 145 all the way to Kuf Nun. That was the Babylonian custom, and the custom among those in Eretz Yisrael, those who follow Talmud Yerushalmi, was to do the 15 Shir Amalos every day. They would finish it with Hodu LaShem, Kitov Kilam Chasto, and the entire Hallel Hagadol. And both of those rites had their own blessings before and after their Pesukei de Zimra, or the Berchas Hashir, Tfilas Hashir of the Minhag Eretz Yisrael. So that we looked in the last time at the early development of Pesukei de Zimra, and we discussed how it came to where it was in the time of the Rishonim. So now we're going to approach the time of the Rishonim, the medieval era. And the medieval era is a new time to study the Pesukei de Zimra because there's a lot of changes in the medieval period in regards to Pesukei de Zimra. And there's a lot of additions, a lot of things that were embellished, and a lot of things that are not just from Kuf Mem Hey all the way to Kuf Nun. And what I want to discuss tonight is how did we get there to the Middle Ages where we have so many embellishments? How did we get to a place where, and I'll share my screen with you. There we go. How did we get to a place where there are not just one or two, but there's at least almost a dozen embellishments to the Pesukei de Zimra that we know today? And on my screen here, as I'm sharing my screen, I'm sharing just roughly 11, but there's more embellishments and additions that were added to the Pesukei de Zimra beyond Ashrei and the Halalukas that were added in medieval times. We have Hashemayim Misaprim Kavod Kel, Yan Hashem Biyom Tzara, Hashem Alech Hashem Alach Hashem Yimloch Le'Laved. We have Hodu LaHashem Kiru B'Shmo, Yichvod Hashem Le'Olam. The first two verses of Ashrei, right? Ashrei Yoshev Veisecha, before we say Tehillah LeDavid, those psukim are from a different parak. We have Mizmor L'Toda, which really should be number 6, but okay. Baruch Hashem Le'Olam Amen V'Amen. Baruch David, V'Charisimo HaBris, which is from Nehemiah, Baruch David, which is from Divrei Yamim. We have Azar Shemoshe, which is, of course, from the Shiras Hayam. So how did we get here? Why is it that in the medieval Sidurim and the medieval witnesses that we have, they received all of these embellishments? Was there a rhyme? Was there a reason? Did they say these verses because it rhymed? Did they have a specific reason for saying these verses? Was there a motivation behind each piece? Typically, when we study Jewish liturgy and we look at a piece of liturgy, one of the best questions to ask ourselves is, what was the motivation behind adding this prayer to the liturgy? And what were the motivations as the generations progressed to retain it and to keep it inside the liturgy? But when we're confronted here with these psalms and these collections of verses, we don't have, what are they called? We don't have original authorships. This is not like we're studying the Kaddish here. What we have here are just psalms. These are from the Torah. These are from Tanakh. These are from Tehillim. So rather than asking why were they written, which is a biblical question, we should ask how did they become a part of the liturgy? And that's a very difficult question to answer when it comes to the Pesukei de Zimra. Part of the problem is with this problem. Part of the problem with studying this is that the oral history of the early history of synagogal prayer was different in the early medieval times than it is today. Typically, when people would go to the synagogue, they would go to the synagogue to start services with Baruch Hu. They would do the Berch Shachar at home. They would do Pesukei de Zimra at home, and they would come to shul for Baruch Hashem Amvorach. It's only into the Middle Ages, like past the year 1000, that we get to the High Middle Ages, that we get the custom shifting where Pesukei de Zimra or even Berch Shachar begins to be said at shul as well. And therefore, we don't have an oral history, even in their time, even in the time of the Rishonim. We simply don't have an oral history of people knowing exactly what everybody else is saying at home. This is a private prayer. And if Pesukei de Zimra was considered a private prayer, which is said at home, how is anybody supposed to know what anybody else does? And to further complicate things, our earliest Sidurim, whether they're halachas farm or otherwise, especially the manuscripts, our earliest manuscripts contain a whole mixed bag of messages. If you look in the Cairo Geniza, you have all different rites with all different confusing fragments of different people's personal customs. You would have, if you look at the Cairo Geniza, of course, you'll see a mixture of Bavli and Yerushalmi customs. But even if you look at the earliest manuscript Sidurim from, let's say, the 13th century, what you'll find is that a lot of the copyists would mix the Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh prayers with the weekday prayers just to save space. They would say, okay, when it's Shabbos, we say this. When it's weekday, we say that. When it's Rosh Chodesh, we say that, because they wanted to save space. And sometimes they would forget to write, oh, on Shabbos, we say this until here. They would like forget to demarcate any of the prayers in the Siddur. So we don't have any oral witnesses in their time. We don't have any textual witnesses from their time of people telling us what they did in the early medieval times, what they did before the year 1000. And most of the evidence we have after the year 1000 is really halachic in nature or fragmentary in nature. And it leaves us guessing. It leaves us guessing as to what people actually did at home, what people actually did in the synagogue. So we have a double problem. First of all, in the early medieval times, it was very private. So no, we don't know what people did, how people practiced Pesukei de Zimra at home. And then in the High Middle Ages, not only was it transferring from private to public worship, not only was it transferring to the basic Knesses where people were starting to say Pesukei de Zimra on the basic Knesses, but most of the evidence we have is fragmentary. And the the halacha only gives us a guess as to what people actually did. And finally, a lot of the textual witnesses themselves, like the manuscript Sidurim, only mix everything up and don't tell us exactly what those kehilos did. So we have a very tough problem ahead of us to figure out how the Pesukei de Zimra actually evolved from early medieval times into the High Middle Ages, meaning, let's say, from 500 to 1000 and from 1000 to roughly 1400. Okay, so now how are we going to start approaching this problem? So one of the ways we could do it is, and I hope am I sharing my screen? Let me share my screen. One of the ways we could do it is to take a time machine and go back to the very beginning. We take a time machine and we go back to the caves of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm not going to discuss the Dead Sea Scrolls right now, but one of the Dead Sea Scrolls is called 11QPS, right? Qumran Cave 11, the Psalm Scroll. And if we look all the way back to the 1st and 2nd centuries as to how these sects were praying, we get some idea of how Jews in that time were thinking about prayer. From the Qumran scrolls, from the scrolls from these sects of Judaism in the Dead Sea, we see that people really wanted to use the Tehillim as a form of liturgy. But what's most important is that we see that their Tehillim liturgy was very much collaborative. We see that they would take Tehillim, they would modify it, And let's say here, if you look at the screen in front of me, this is the famous 11Q Q PSA, one of the most famous pieces of Tehillim from the Qumran caves, and this is Ashrei, right? It starts Tehillah LeDavid. After every pasuk, they end Baruch Shem Kvod Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo LeOlam Va'ed. Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo LeOlam Va'ed. After every pasuk, people are answering Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo Baruch Baruch Hu L'Olam Va'ed. And incidentally, this is interesting to Bible critics, is that instead of not having a nun, this Ashrei does have a pasuk that starts with a nun, which even the Bible critics say no, this is just made up. They made up the pasuk with a nun, and really David HaMelech never wrote a nun. They hold like the Gemara. The Gemara holds there was no nun in Ashrei. But regardless, we do see from the work of the Jews in the liturgical papers of the Jews in the Qumran, a deep connection to Tehillim for their liturgy, and we see that they wanted to use the Tehillim to create a morning liturgy, and they used it in a collaborative sense, and they would modify Tehillim. They would turn them from chapters into verses. They would break them down in order to make a sort of liturgy. And again, this is our best guess based on the data we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the point I'm trying to bring across here is that from the earliest times, Pesukei Zimra was very fluid, and there were many people trying to use different psalms and different ways of using Tehillim or different songs from throughout Tanakh in order to create a morning liturgy of song to Hashem. That's point number one. Point number two, of course, is that it was very collaborative, and that they wanted to involve the kahal in the song. Point number two, let's move fast forward to the earliest ideas about how the Pesukei de Zimra developed. There was a non-Jewish scholar whose name was Karl Anton Baumstark. He was a German scholar of liturgy. And his expertise was, of course, in all Oriental liturgy, not just in Jewish liturgy, but also Christian liturgy. He came up with a fancy idea called comparative, I think he called it comparative liturgy or comparative analysis of liturgy. His idea is essentially, well, if you take how people daven and you compare one to the other, then what you could do is you could see, well, I have this minig, this minig, this minig, and this minig, and let's see what's similar between them, and let's see if there's a system that is a common denominator, if there's a structure that's a common denominator, and then you could reverse engineer how the original design was of the tefillah. This was an approach taken by some early scholars of Jewish liturgy, not religious and irreligious. Many scholars wanted to say that if you look at the Pesukei de Zimra, you could deconstruct it, and you could come back to some sort of system, some sort of construction. For example, let's say there's 18 names of a god here, or there's 10 expressions of praise of God here, or you could say that there's 10 praises of David from King David that are deliberately placed within their in order here or there. This approach was taken by some, and Rabbi Leon Liebrich was one of the early scholars to publish a piece where he tries to find a system to how Pesukei de Zimra was constructed. His belief, of course, is that his belief is very ingenious, but he believes that Pesukei de Zimra, as we have it today, is the result of a tension between two schools of thought. One school of thought holds that you're supposed to put Malchus Shemayim first, and the other school of thought holds that you're supposed to put Haskar Hashem Hashem and Bracha first. And these two schools of thought battled it out. So Haidula Hashem, I think, has Malchus Shemayim first, and Vayvarach David has Bracha first. He has a very interesting system where he shows this tension between what do we say first? Do we praise Hashem and Malchus do we praise Hashem by speaking of his sovereignty? Do we praise God by talking about his names and blessing him? Two different ways of praising God. Regardless of his research, one of the interesting things to note is that many of the verses selected for the additions to Pesukei de Zimra, the things that embellished the Babylonian tradition from 145 to 150, from Kuf Mem Hey all the way to Kuf Nun, one of the features that we see of the Pesukim that are chosen is that these are Pesukim which speak about God's sovereignty, right? They talk about Malchus Hashem, whether it's Haidu, whether it's Az Yashir, whether it's Vayvarach David, L'cha Hashem Amamlecha V'Misnase, or all throughout Hodu, or all throughout Az Yashir, we speak about God's sovereignty. Another feature is the Baruch Hashem La'olam Amen V'Amen, Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael, Vayvarach David as Hashem. another feature we see among the passages that are chosen are things that bless God or things that bless God's name. So those are the 2 or 3 features that we see in the additions that are added to the Pesukei de Zimra or the verses of song. Okay, but that's Liebrich and his friends who are following the Baumstar comparative method of studying liturgy. Now, along come scholars like Rabbi Yosef Heinemann and Jacob Petachowski, and they have a very different approach, and they make a very strong criticism of an approach like Leon Liebrich. Let me get my microphone back in check. So part of the best criticism of this approach is that most of the way, just get this to behave. Tech support, perfect. So most of the way that people like Rabbi Liebrich analyze the tefillah was using modern minhagim. You cannot use a modern minhag, a modern rite, to deconstruct the actual system of Pesukei de Zimra. That makes absolutely no sense. If you take the modern minhag of the Teimanim and the Sfardim and the Ashkenazim, and you take, the Italian nusach, and you try to compare all of them, what you're looking at is the modern canonization from the last few hundred years of how the Pesukei de Zimra came to be. And you're not looking at how it originally came to be in the in the early medieval times, or in the time of the Tanam Amiram. If you just take one look at the Karageniza, or you take a look at the Machzor Vitri, even from the 11th century France, take one look at those Sidurim, and you'll see a completely different set of Pesukei de Zimra than you're familiar with today. There's completely different additions, completely different embellishments. So you can't take, and very often a completely different order of the way things are put. So you can't just take a modern minhag and say, well, this is how the system is. This is how it was constructed. Some people didn't say Vavarach David. Some people didn't say Haidu. Some people didn't say Az Yashir. How are you going to use your modern nuschais to deconstruct a system or a set of ideas or a construct or a tension or some theory for how Pesukei de Zimra developed? How could you use that using modern nuschai? So that doesn't work. So along comes the base of Heinemann, and he says, of course, you have to use the form critical method. You have to think in terms of the groups of the various groups of people and the mindset and the zeitgeist of every single place that developed the certain prayers. And he takes a completely different approach to studying all prayers, including Pesukei de Zimra. One more opinion of note is Ismar Elbogen, pictured here on the right. He says that, well, he believes that because most of Pesukei de Zimra developed after the Churban Beis Hamikdash, much of the consciousness of those who compiled Pesukei de Zimra was revolving around the Karbanas, and it was revolving around replacing the shirim of the Levium in the Beis Hamikdash. And therefore, we see shirim, we see songs like Haidu Lashem Kiru B'Shmai, which was said over Karbanis, or Mizmar Latoda, which is said for a Karban Toda. And therefore, he believes that many of those additions, those psalms that were added in later to the Pesukei de Zimra, that are not from the original core 6 Tehillim, those come from a consciousness of restoring the shirim of the Levium of the Beis Hamikdash. That's an interesting approach, but it's very hard to make that argument when you fast forward 1,000 years after the Beis Hamikdash. Why would somebody wake up in the 800s and decide that he's going to try to replace the shirim of the Levium? It's not going to be in his consciousness as well. So it's an interesting approach, but it's not necessarily a concrete approach. What's much more likely is that you're going to have to take a form critical approach of every single, not just form critical, but also a geographic approach of every single nusach that you're going to find. Okay. So I believe, and I'm going to start with my own theory here, as they say, Neos Daiti in the yeshiva world. I think that one of the best places to begin with understanding the earliest rites and the earliest nuschais of Pesukei de Zimra is in Provence. And the Jews of Provence represent a tremendous bridge and a really important place to look for the earliest development of Pesukei de Zimra. Why do I say that? So if we look at the earliest important Sidurim we have. Many of them come from France, like the Machzor Vitry, most notably. And the Machzor Vitry itself in northern France, not in southern France, has a lot of interesting, it spells out a lot of interesting variations in Pesukei de Zimra as we have them today. But in the south of France, which we call today Provence, there was even more information that was contained there by the rabbis at the time. You see, Provence sat at the border between Spain and northern France. So we're not talking about Provence as in the jurisdiction Provence that we would call today in France. Rather, Provence, when we say Chachmei Provencia, the sages of Provence, we really mean the entire Occitania, the entire southern area of France, which contains Narbonne, Lunel, Montpellier, Languedoc, Arles. All the names are escaping me. Avignon. Many of the areas of southern France today, which used to be called Occitania, existed in Provence. And when you look at the earliest halachic sources, the earliest Bale halacha were in Provence. One of the scholars who studies Provence calls it a renaissance in the shadow of the church. Essentially, the Jews of Provence accepted and received a lot of the science and a lot of the Torah from the Jews of Spain, and also a lot of the Torah from the Jews in the north in Germany and in France. So they were a tremendous translation engine and a tremendous hub of not just learning, but also of creativity and generation and translation. And they bridged two worlds between Spain and northern and France and Germany and what was called at the time Alemania, right? The northern Anche Rhinos, the people who followed the Rhine River. So in Provence, part of their creativity was that they began writing works on halacha. We have the Sefer HaManig, the Sefer HaEshkol, the Sefer Orchos Chaim, the Shibbolei Haleketz, Italian, but also influenced by Provence. And a lot of these early works of halacha are the first clues we have for a deep exploration of the way the Pesukei de Zimra developed. And it's there that we see a lot of the customs that are mentioned there, like in the Sefer Orchos Chaim, where he talks about how things are done in their shul, or in the Sefer HaEshkol, or in the Sefer HaManig. These are the earliest sources which give us a lot of information about who said Hodu, why they decided to say Hodu, who said Az Yashir, why they thought you had to say Az Yashir. And although other sources are very nice, I believe that Provence really gives us some of the best and the most information regarding Pesukei de Zimra. That's my opinion, but again, I don't have enough time to really hammer home why I believe that, but we're going to rush through now as much as I can all of the Pesukei de Zimra that we can cover. My main theory for how the Pesukei de Zimra was embellished, and this is something I want to rest on the Chachmei Provence, is my main theory for what got chosen is the transfer. Is that my main theory for why the six Tehillim didn't remain the six Tehillim Pesukei de Zimra is because of Shabbos and Reish Chodesh. Essentially, my theory goes like this: before the turn of the millennium, most Jews said Pesukei de Zimra at home, and it was a private matter. The only time they said Pesukei de Zimra in shul was on Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh when people had more time. And that's when the Chazan would be the one to say Pesukei de Zimra, and the Kahal would do it along with him. After the turn of the millennia, you had a custom appear where more people would start saying Pesukei de Zimra in the synagogue. So what happens here? Most of the Jews are educated as to what is correct Pesukei de Zimra only when they go to shul. Remember, if you're a Jew who's born in 900, how do you know what Pesukei de Zimra to say at home? Well, either you're taught by your father or your Rebbe, or you go to shul. When do you go to shul and hear Pesukei de Zimra? Only on Shabbos and Reish Chodesh. That's the only time you're going to hear Pesukei de Zimra. So if you go to shul every Shabbos or every Reish Chodesh, and you hear them saying an extra mizmar for Shabbos or Reish Chodesh, you're not necessarily going to know that that's only for Shabbos or Reish Chodesh. And it's my belief that the confusion between that distinction of Shabbos versus Reish Chodesh versus a weekday psalm is what caused so many of the embellishments that we have to the Pesukei de Zimra. what started with 6 psalms almost tripled in size into a Pesukei Zimra, which has elements of Torah, of Nevi'im, and of Ksubim. So that's my theory. And my theory, again, once more, is that it was people come to synagogue mostly on Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh. That's when they hear the Pesukei Zimra. So therefore, privately, when they say Pesukei Zimra at home, they also include those psalms. And eventually they get mixed and mashed, and nobody knows the difference between the psalms, which are only said on Shabbos or Rosh Chodesh, and the psalms that are said when in private. And that's why we have so many more psalms ending up in the liturgy. I have multiple proofs for this, especially in Rabbi Yehuda ben Yakar, who's a Provençal scholar in the works of Orchos Chaim, or from Aaron Milunil, in the works of the Sefer Manik, Sefer Eshkol, etc. Many times you'll see hints to this. So let's begin. And we're going to run out of time, but I'm going to try to race through this, God willing. Wow. Let me share my screen if possible. We might have to continue this like part 1, part 2 next week. Heaven help us. Okay. Sorry it was late. We had some special family time we had to get done tonight. Okay. One of the earliest sources for the embellishment of Pesukei Zimra is, of course, in Maseches Seifrim, Yud Zayin Yud Aleph. Says the Brisa, or probably not a Brisa. This is probably composed in like the 8th or the 9th century. It's talking about Rosh Chodesh. It says, "V'tzrichen leimer achri yehi kavod Hashem, Hashem Melech, Mizmar Shiu LaHashem, Divrei Seifrim, v'achrav haydu LaHashem kiru b'shmai, v'sheishes mezorim shel kol yom." So there's a couple of things here that it says you have to say in Rosh Chodesh. 2 of them you're probably very familiar with, saying Yehi Kavod Hashem every day. Shiu LaHashem Shir Chadash, right? Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach, Hashem Yimloch La'olam Va'ed. Shiu LaHashem Shir Chadash, which is for Rosh Chodesh specifically. And then finally you say Haydu LaHashem Kiru B'Shmai, and then the six Mizorim of every day. What are we seeing here? We're seeing that in the 9th or the 8th century, there's Haydu, and there's Yehi Kavod Hashem, and there's a Hashem Melech. 3 very important things. Now, that's pretty early. The 7th, 8th, somewhere between the 7th, 8th, and 9th century, it's already in a early Gaonic era. We're seeing that the Jews are saying these 3 important things. Now, what's very important is that, remember, it doesn't even say all the verses of Yehi Chavod. It just expects you to know Yichvod Hashem Olam, even though those are various verses from throughout Psalms. It just says Yichvod Hashem, Hodol Hashem Kir B'Shmo, and expects you to know what it's talking about, which is fascinating, which tells you that by the 7th or 8th century, it was already so well known that it didn't have to explain itself, which would probably push the date back around 150, 200 years at the very minimum, if by then it was so well known. If it says Hashem Melech and it doesn't have to tell you, this is probably early medieval, so roughly the 500s or 600s, where this practice starts to get developed of saying these things as a permanent fixture of Pesukei Zimra. So that's a very important early source. Okay. Now, why Haidu? Haidu Lashem Kiru B'Shmo is, of course, part of Divrei Yamim. It's where David HaMelech sings a song because the Aron was returned from the Plishtim. The Plishtim stole the Aron. They ransacked Shiloh. God struck them down with plagues. They returned the Aron, and David proceeds the Aron to a tent, which he makes in Yerushalayim. They bring Karbanis in front of the Aron, and they sing songs, and they bring Karbanis there in Yerushalayim for 43 years until they build the Beis HaMikdash. So those songs, that song that he taught them to say is Haydu Lashem Kiru B'Shmo. I believe it's in the Seder, let me just share my screen again. Seder Olam Rabbah. In Seder Olam Rabbah, it says in Yudalid that they would say it, Bayoma, who was it? B'Shachar Hayom Haydu Lashem Kiru B'Shmo, Ad Al Tigu B'Sheichai. And Ben Arbayim Ayom Hashem Kol Haaretz Ad V'Yimar Kol Ha'Men V'Halal Hashem, meaning that they used to split it up. That in their time, when they were still singing before the building of the Beis Hamikdash, they would split Hodu into 2 parts, say one in the morning Tamid and one in the evening Tamid. And the Rishonim believe that they still did this in the time of the Beis Hamikdash as well. So Hodu Hashem was used by the Karbanos of the Beis Hamikdash. Very interesting. So, according to the Rishonim believe that the reason Hodu Hashem was added is because it was added near the Karbanis. Since we just said the Karbanis early in the morning, we should add it to Pesukei de Zimra because it should start Pesukei de Zimra following the Karbanos, and we should say Psukim, which were said in the Beis HaMikdash in regards to the Karbanos, or by the Karbanos. Now, some of the early Gaonim or early Rishonim sources don't have Hodu Lashem Kirubishmo, especially the Rambam doesn't have it. So the Teimanim until this day only say Hodu Lashem Kirubishmo on Shabbat. But what I find interesting is two things. First of all, that Maseches Sofrim says it only by Rosh Chodesh. Second of all, is that if you look in the Siddur of Shlomo ben Rav Shimshon from Worms, he holds that they only said it on Shabbat and they would only say it responsively when people had more time. So it's my belief that originally the minhag was to say it only on Rosh Chodesh. Then they started saying it on Rosh Chodesh or Shabbos whenever they had more time. And then eventually more and more Jews began saying it every single day. Since they got used to saying it on Shabbat, it also transferred to the weekday liturgy. That's my own theory. And it's just in line with the way I'm currently seeing things. Hashem Elach Hashem Elach Hashem Yimloch Olam Ved. That's the next part of the liturgy we should just quickly touch on. This is a very early minhag. Of course, we just saw it in Seifrim. The Siddur of Amram has it for Shabbat, right? As I mentioned, again, the thing seems to start off as a minhag of Shabbat. And in the Sefer HaManig, the Ravan is quoted as saying that we only say it here on Shabbat. And also in Spain and in Provence, they would say it on Shabbat, and they would repeat Hashem Melech twice. Now, the first source for this language, Hashem Melech Hashem Melech Hashem Melech Hashem Melech Hashem Melech Ve'ed, is in Heichalot Rabati. It's a famous medrash which says, Amar B'Akiva B'chol Yom Malach Echad Omeid Be'emtza Rakia. There's every day there's an angel that stands in the middle of heaven, and he opens and he says Hashem Melech Hashem Melech Hashem Melech Ve'ed, and all of the legions of the heavens respond after him until they get to Baruch Hu Hashem Bayach. So this medrash in Heichalos sounds like it's saying that while the Jews are praying in the morning, the angels in the morning are also praying, and they begin with Hashem Malach Hashem Malach, and all the angels stand to say this. So even though this began in many places in Klal Yisrael as a minhag on Shabbat, it seems to have spread to the point where the Beis Yosef and the Torah already mentioned this as, I believe it's the Torah, but I could be wrong, as a minhag that people would say every single day. Shpulei Eleket says that we stand in order to be like the Malachim, but many people would only do it during the Shabbat because that's when we had time. You know, a weekday we don't have time to add extra things to the Pesukei de Zimra. Mizmar Latoda is attributed in the Gemara and Shavuos to being part of the Mizmayim that the Levium would say in the Beis HaMikdash by a Karban Toda. But if you look in, let me just show you the Gemara Shavuos. It's Tanaban Shir Shal Toda B'Kneres V'Neim B'Tzatzalm Al Kol Pina V'Pina V'Al Kol Avin G'dayim Sh'Yushalayim V'Omer, and they would say Armim Chashem K'di L'Sani V'Shir Shal B'Gayim. Right? They would say the Shir Shal Toda by every Karban Toda. Okay. Now, if you look at the Siddur from Worms from Shlomo ben Rav Shimshon, what you'll see is that he says that we say it slowly. Let me pull this up 1 second. I think he says, no, it wasn't Shlomo ben Rav Shimshon. It's Yehuda ben Yakar from Provence. He says that Mizmar Latoda, we say it with a song, and we say it slowly and nicely. And some in Hagamar, we only say it on Shabbat. The Abu Durham says that some people only say it Shabbat, and that some people only say it not on Shabbat because Mizmar, we don't bring a Karban Toda on Shabbat. So you have a funny changeover from before the turn of from the earlier medieval times to later medieval times, where originally it's added for Shabbat only because you could see there was apparently some sort of rhyme or reason, some sort of a nice long song which lended people to say Mizmar Latoda. Maybe it's an introduction for Mizmar Shilam Shabbat Tov Lahodot Lashem. Perhaps it's something like that. But then later people are like, wait a second, we don't say bring a Karban Toda on Shabbat. So they stopped saying it on Shabbat, and that's the minhag today. Many Jews don't say Mizmar Latoda on Shabbat. Again, in their time, we have a few attestations that they also said La Shemayim Misaprim Kavod Kel every day. That Abu Darham says many people said La Shemayim Misaprim Kavod Kel every day before Baruch Sha'amar, but they would only say it on Shabbat. Our minhag is we only say it on Shabbat. Other people do it by weekday, but we don't. That's what the Abu Darham says. Now, as far as Yehi Kavod Hashem Le'olam, the Rishonim see Yehi Kavod Hashem, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna let me just cycle through my images here to see if I have. Okay, good. The Rishonim see Yehi Kavod Hashem Le'olam as essentially a introduction to Ashrei. As far as they see it, Yehi Kavod Hashem Le'olam is a whole bunch of psukim which were used to introduce the Ashrei. And if you think about that for a second, that means that there was a collaborative prayer. There was a collaborative sung introduction, which they would sing a melodic introduction to the Ashrei. This is just the way, this is not my own theory. This is simply the way that the Rishonim see it. And some of the Minhagim, by the way, have an extra pasuk here. They're like Utza Etza Vitufar from Yeshaya. They put in even the Tiamanim today still do it that way. The Rambam did it that way. If Saadia Gaon does it that way, there were various readings of Yehichvod Hashem La'olama. We don't know exactly how they did it in the early medieval times, but from the fact that the Rishonim see it as an introduction to Tehillah LeDavid, that would also lend credence to the possibility that perhaps is also originally part of Yehichvod Hashem La'olam. That it was originally a part of those original verses. And the whole Yehichvod Hashem La'olam system was originally introduced as a melodic or harmonic introduction to the Pesukei de Zimra. If you look at just at the syllable, the amount of syllables they have in Yehichvod Hashem La'olam, you already see that it's harmonious, that it has a element of song. Give me 1 second. I have to just pause the recording for Kaddish. Okay. So although this is difficult to prove, just to continue after we stop the recording, I do believe that Yehichvod was a introduction they used to Tehillah LeDavid on the days that they had time, and eventually it became a part and parcel of the Pesukei de Zimra, especially from the responsive ways we see that early Rishonim would say Yehichvod Hashem La'olam. Now, I do want to discuss Ashrei Yoshev Secha and Vayvarach David and Azashir. I don't think we have time by the end of this recording, so what I'm probably going to do is we're going to daven Marvit here. Let me just pause the video here. And I think I'm going to append a video to the end of this class for YouTube so that everybody can finish the class later. Okay. All right. This is going to be a lot better audio. Thanks everybody for sticking around. I'm continuing here from the shul's office. So here we go. Let me exit here. Let's continue where we left off. Right. So we just finished speaking about Yehichvod Hashem. Ashrei Yoshev Secha. Fascinating topic. So when did we start calling it Ashrei? As you all know, Kuf Mem Hey starts off, the parak Kuf Mem Hey starts off with the words Tehillah LeDavid. So when did we start calling it Ashrei? So there's a Gemara in Brachos, and this is in in Brachos Daled Amud Beis. Let me share my screen with you. A little easier here. Gemara in Brachos Daf Daled Amud Beis, where it says Amar B'Yechanan, and I think you could read it here. B'pnei ma lo nemar nun be'ashrei, b'pnei sheyesh b'maplashin shel sonei Yisrael, shel Oveim shel Yisrael, I believe. Now, in almost all of the versions of Shas, it says b'pnei ma lo nemar nun be'ashrei, and therefore, some scholars have been like, oh, wait, I get it. So if it says in Talmud Bavli already, if Talmud Bavli already is calling Ashrei, Tehillah LeDavid Ashrei, it must be this is really old. From the time of Rabbi Yechanan already, people are calling Tehillah LeDavid Ashrei. And therefore, they believe that Ashrei is a really, really old term. I'm very skeptical of that. First of all, because we have this Paris manuscript. We have the Paris manuscript says Pnei Malay Nemar Nun B'Tehillah LeDavid, but also because almost all of the early sources that I could find from the time of the Geonim almost always call Tehillah LeDavid. They don't call it anything else. One time, I think of Natronai Gaon calls it Parasha Rishona, right, the first parasha, but he doesn't call it Tehillah LeDavid. He doesn't call Ashrei Tehillah. He doesn't call Ashrei. It would seem to me that in the time of the Geonim, they still had the sense that it was called Tehillah LeDavid, and Ashrei was a separate part. Some Rishonim see Ashrei, the words Ashrei, as being part of an introduction to the Tehillah LeDavid. Now, was it an introduction that was a part of Yehichvod, or was it a separate introduction? That's another question. My belief is that it was originally a section on its own, and it was its own introduction to the Ashrei that was used on Shabbat or on other times when people had an extra amount of time, and eventually a whittled down version became the standard introduction. Why do I think this? Because if you open a Machzor Vitri, and I'm holding one right here, and you look at the beginning of Ashrei, they say, as Tosafot in Lamed Beit Amud Beit in Shas, Tosafot says that the French would say Ashrei Harbe. They would say many Ashreis. Now, there's a Mesorah in the Medrash that there's 20 Ashreis in Tehillim for the 20 Ois in Eov, whatever that means. 20 happies for the 20 Ois. But Rashi, the minhag of northern France was that before they would say Ashrei Yoshev Yetecha, they would say Ashrei Tamimei Derech. They would say, let me find the actual language here. Ashrei Notzrei Dota B'chol Vidushu. Ashrei Yishirei Es Hashem B'Masot Chafetz Mod. Ashrei Shomer Mishpat Asei Tzedaka B'cholet. Etc., etc. Ashrei Agever, Ashrei Tamimei Derech. Finally, Ashrei Yoshev Yetecha Od Yahalulu Chasela until the end. This is just the minhag of northern France. Now, other Rishonim, such as Tosafot, lambast it. Rabbi Yehuda Chassid says, absolutely not. You can't change the amount of words. This is added for a reason, and they all lambast this minhag of the northern French. My suspicion, however, is that those original words of Ashrei Yoshev Yesecha are just the last words of a chazanic introduction to Tehillah LeDavid. This chazanic introduction of Tehillah LeDavid spread far and wide. People would say it when they had extra time, but if they didn't have time, they would just suffice themselves with the last words of this introduction from the Chazanim. They would do Asher Yoshev Chasela, Asher Yamsha Kachalo, Asher Hamsha Shemalo Kav. They would say the last two verses of that longer introduction, and they would use that as an introduction for Tehillah LeDavid. That's my theory. I believe it comes from the Shabbat, it comes from the Rosh Chodesh, and then it was eventually added to the rest of Tehillah LeDavid. Now, of course, the Rishonim and Achronim have other reasons why this was added, and the Mekubalim. But for now, I'm going to work with what we have in the time of the Rishonim. So we'll get to some of those later theories. So to some of those later theories later, especially this theories from the Achronim and the Mekubalim. We're going to, God willing, get to those theories later. Now, how about Vayvarech David? I wish I kept my notes open for Vayvarech David. Our earliest sources, I believe, for Vayvarech David are in the Siddur of Amram Gaon. He has it until V'halol Hashem. He doesn't have the section of V'chartu Imo Habirit. Then we have, I believe it's mentioned in Rav Sadia for Shabbat, if I'm not mistaken. And then what happens is that we see a bridge where the psukim for Nehemiah V'chartu Imo Habirit are added to the end of Vayvarech David. So already in the time of the Rishonim, this was well understood that what happens is as follows. Somebody decided Vayvarech David is a shira that should be added to the Pesukei Zimra. That's first of all. But second of all, there's no connection between Vayvarech David and Az Yashir. So once Az Yashir became a part of the liturgy, they needed something to bridge the two. So they continued Vayvarech David with psukim which were related to Vayvarech David, which was V'chartu Imo Habrit, and then at the end of it talks about Kriyat Yamsuf, and that bridges it into Az Yashir, and that's how that addition, both Vayvarech David and V'chartu Imo Habrit, got into the Pesukei Zimra. The real question is who decided to add Vayvarech David. If it's as early as Amram Gaon, the answer is, well, we don't know. We know that. We know that it's there, but we don't know who added it. It appears to be something that people added when they had extra time. And one of the themes we see in Vayvarech David is that it talks about bracha of Hashem and it talks about the malchus of Hashem. Yehuda ben Yakar has an important theory where he says there's 10 mizmayim of David HaMelech, and they added Vayvarech David to get to a 10th. That's why they added Vayvarech David, which is an interesting theory, but even his counting is not so accurate, because if you actually count it from Hodu all the way to Vayvarech David, you don't really exactly get 10. But that's his theory. Now, the Baruch Hashem L'Olam Amen V'Amen is a mystery. The Rishonim all speak about the Maharam Mirottenberg. Maharam Mirottenberg, if somebody interrupted him during Pesukei Zimra, he had an onus and he had to talk. Before he would talk to somebody, let's say there was a sakana, he would say Baruch Hashem L'Olam Amen V'Amen, Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael Min Olam V'Ad Olam. Before he would speak to somebody. Why? Oh, look at that. My page is printed. And then it ran out of paper. Okay, fascinating. I thought I ran out of paper. Okay, so it seems that the Maharam felt that those pesukim are like a bracha, and therefore instead of saying yishtabach, he would interrupt with those pesukim. The Rif famously the Rif says that Baruch Shamar until Yishtabach is like an opening bracha and a closing bracha. So the Rif invents a halacha where he says you can't talk in between Baruch Shamar and Yishtabach. It doesn't look like the Maram completely agreed with that. It could be that the Maram held Mikra Hadin you could talk because those brachas were instituted later. And therefore, we don't know exactly why, but the Maram would use Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael or Baruch Hashem Olam Amen V'Amen. He would use those as brachas to finish Pesukei de Zimra if he was interrupted. So the theory goes among the Achronim and the Rishonim that since we're adding new things to Pesukei de Zimra, before we add these new things, we should interrupt and say Baruch Hashem L'Olam Amen V'Amen and say like a quasi Yishtabach before we go on to Vayvarach David and Az Yashir. Now, the earliest source for Az Yashir is actually Tshuva and the Gaonim. The Rabbi Gaon was asked about Az Yashir. Do we say Az Yashir? Should we say Az Yashir every day? And he says, in the yeshivas, we don't say Az Yashir. I don't know what you're talking about. It's not our minhag. We immediately close with Yishtabach. In other places, they have the minhag to say Az Yashir on Shabbat and Yom Tov, but we don't object to the practice. A few years later, in the Siddur of Sadi Gaon, he says that some people say Az Yashir all the way until Shirat Miriam, but he's talking about the weekdays, which sounds like in Egypt or in other places that were further away from the jurisdiction of the yeshivas in Bavel, they would say Az Yashir every day. So it sounds like a Bavli Yerushalmi thing, where the Jews of Eretz Yisrael in the later medieval times began to say, I should say in early medieval times began to say Az Yashir to add that to their Pesukei de Zimra every day or their Tefillas Yashir every day. I'm guessing here because again, this is something from Egypt, something that Rav Sadia Gaon is familiar with, and he says it's a nice midig. It's not Meker Dedina, but the Tamanim until today still say Az Yashir all the way to the end of Shirat Miriam. It's a very beautiful thing. The Machzor says something absolutely fascinating. The Machzor brings a tshuva in Hilchot Tisha B'Av in Siman Reish Samach Hey. Machzor brings a claim from the communities of Rome that they said that in Eretz Yisrael, our communities of Rome, which have been here since Golos Ba'Yesheni, because everybody in Rome thinks they've been there since Golos Ba'Yesheni, that our minhag here and in Spain is that we would say Az Yashir every day. Now, this is the minhag Italy. This is what we've been doing all the way since Eretz Yisrael. So it sounds like the minhag, again, was a minhag of the Jews who were under the jurisdiction of Eretz Yisrael, those early Jews from Spain and the Jews of Italy who had an early minhag. Lastly, the Rambam brings the minhag as well. He also brings the minhag. Some Jews would say ha'azinu, and he recommends saying it after Yishtabach, not to make a hefsek, since this is a new thing. Don't make a hefsek in regular standard Pesukei de Zimra. Say it after Yishtabach. The Sefer Itim objects to the custom of saying it before Yishtabach. The Manig says that by his point, already in the 12th century in Provence, almost everybody says it, and therefore it's not appropriate to skip it, and you should add the Az Yashir to the Pesukei de Zimra. So as far as I believe, we've just gone through a crash course of all the additions to the Pesukei de Zimra and the basic theory for how they got added. The dominant theme, again, to recap, to too long didn't read, the dominant theme here seems to be that the core Pesukei de Zimra, as far as the Talmud Bavli minhag was concerned, began with 6 mizmorim, and then in public service, when people would do Pesukei de Zimra in public, which is usually on Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, there were other psukim added and other psalms, parakim, added. Over time, many Jews began to confuse the parakim that was said in synagogue as also parakim of the standard Pesukei de Zimra that they should say every day. And therefore, we have discrepancies between different minhagim about what to add and when. Some would only say certain things on weekdays. Some would only say it on Shabbat. Some had a minhag to specifically say things if you're only alone. Some had a specific, because their father told them, no, you only say that alone at home. Some say we only say this, and we only say this one if you have a minyan and you have in your betzibur. Some say have a specific minhag about these things, and we only say it with a song. It seems clear that a lot of these earlier embellishments were originally melodic or responsive, collaborative psalms that were said with the tzibur when the tzibur had more time, such as holidays, Shabbat, and Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh. That's my theory. That's what it seems to be, and it seems to be that most of the extra Pesukei de Zimra developed by some would call it accident, some would call it coincidence, some would call it siyata deshmaya, of God's will over the history of what becomes the standardized Pesukei de Zimra. As far as a halachic sense goes, of course, the core 6 are the most important. from Ashrei all the way until the end of Hallelujah. Those are the 6 most important, since they are the prime core of the Pesukei Zimra. That's what Talmud Bavli essentially began with, and the rest of them are just later additions. Now, by later, of course, we mean even 700s, even the 6th century, 7th century, 8th century. A lot of these additions got there at least by the early medieval period. So these are Kadosh Maharek. They say Kadosh Maharek Kedem, right? The holy of the earliest mountains of high, and no Jew would ever contest the holiness and the importance of these additions to the Pesukei de Zimra. So, God willing, next week, if we have more time, we will delve into a couple of the extra theologies and the extra reasons that the Rishonim developed and the Achronim developed around the various Pesukei de Zimra, especially in regards to the much later modern additions to the Pesukei de Zimra, which are, looks like Gary just had to run out, but next week we're gonna study the modern editions, some of the Mizmorim that were added, like the Kalon Kamas Hashem, the Mizmor Shir Chanukah Sabayis David, some of the additions to Pesukei de Zimra that were added in the past 500 years. So thank you everybody for your time and attention. I'm sorry this took so long and that we changed our scenery, but we will continue. And let me just check my slides to make sure I didn't have anything else I wanted to show you. This is the papal states that I was going to put in the to explain the Komtat, but we didn't have time to get to that tonight. So we will continue Bezrat Hashem next week.